There is a version of you that has been disappearing in small, unremarkable ways, not in one dramatic moment, but across all the times you adjusted, explained, waited, and tried again. This is about what happens when that version of you finally stops. There is a moment, thin as a breath you hold without realizing it, when silence stops being a response and becomes a revelation, not a cold gesture, not a psychological game, but the purest expression of a truth you ignored for far too long. The people who never noticed you when you spoke begin to feel you only when you stop. It is in this empty space, heavy with everything you endured quietly, that their minds fill with questions they don't have the courage to ask you. Questions born not from love, but from the fear of losing what they always took for granted. Silence carries a power no explanation ever will. It cuts through the noise, reveals what matters, and above all shows who you have become while they were convinced you would always be available, predictable, present. When you stop chasing, the emotional landscape shifts. You are no longer the one reaching for confirmation. They are the ones searching for traces of you in the cracks of their own insecurity. And in this quiet reversal lives a strength you never dared to claim. Your absence weighs more than any attempt to be understood, because the truth is simple, even if it hurts. When you spoke, they weren't listening. When you explained, they didn't understand. When you tried to save what was collapsing, they chose to look away. But when you go silent, when you finally let the silence do the work words never could, something cracks inside them, a certainty, a habit. Their wrong assumption that you would always be there waiting, and it is precisely in that moment that they feel the absence of what they never knew how to protect. This is not an invitation to revenge, and it is not a celebration of ego. It is a recognition, the realization that your value does not depend on those who cannot see it, that choosing silence is not punishing someone else, it is saving yourself. And it is here, in this quiet rebirth, that your real inner journey begins, one where you no longer beg for attention, but cultivate presence, where you no longer chase answers, but build peace. If you want to go deeper into this kind of work, learning to hold your ground without reaction, I left my ebook, The Power of Not Reacting, in the first pinned comment. It is a practical guide for exactly this kind of shift. You notice the change in the most ordinary moments of the day, not the ones everyone imagines, not in the official goodbye, not in the sharp silence that came after. You feel it instead in the spaces where your mind simply stops running after someone who always preferred distance to presence. It happens on an ordinary morning. You open your eyes and, for the first time in a long time, that heavy thought that used to press against your chest the moment you woke up is no longer there. It feels like something is missing, like walking out of the house without your keys. Strange, off. And yet underneath all of it, a calm voice whispers, "This time is different." You go to the kitchen, make your coffee with the same movements as always. Same mug, same spoon, same routine. But what you feel inside is no longer a weight. There is a new lightness, tentative but real. You stir and realize you are not replaying the words you needed to hear and never received. You are in the middle of something, a task, a conversation, a meal, and you realize you have not thought about them in hours. Not because you forced the thought away, because your attention has quietly found other things to land on. Things that were always there, waiting for you to return. You pass a place the two of you once knew. You expect the old tightening. Instead, there is something quieter, not indifference, but distance. The kind of distance that belongs to you now, not to what happened there. You keep walking. No ceremony, no internal scene, just forward. Many people call it moving on, but the truth is more precise than that. It is not detachment, it is awakening. It is the moment when you stop inventing stories to justify the intermittent presence of someone who never learned to stay long enough to build them with you. Then you begin to notice other signals. Your mind stops spiraling into imagined scenarios. The thoughts that once ruled your mood lose their grip, one grain at a time. This transformation does not arrive with fanfare. It is like a quiet correction, a subtle readjustment that reminds you their absence is not a mystery. It is a message. It is everything you refuse to see. One evening you find yourself alone in your room, the window slightly open, soft light tracing the walls. Life feels ordinary, but something inside you sharpens with new precision. From the silence, a truth surfaces that no conversation with them ever let you touch. They did not leave because you were not enough. They left because real intimacy requires depth, and depth was something they never learned to enter. Their distance stops being a sentence and becomes what it always was, a limitation. Theirs, not yours. That awareness dissolves the illusion, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who finally stops shrinking to accommodate someone else's fears. The silence they left you with no longer hurts. It becomes a mirror. It becomes an answer. It becomes the door you choose to walk through instead of waiting outside. You feel the change settle into something stable, like a new breath in your bones, quiet, clear, inevitable. Your story no longer orbits around someone who never knew how to hold it. You come back to yourself, slowly, steadily, with strength. And it is here that the real emotional work begins. You understand it even more clearly when you watch how certain people move through everyday life, not the dramatic moments, because those who fear closeness don't reveal themselves in their breakdowns. They reveal themselves in the discomfort they feel when affection gets too close. You see it when, after sharing something intimate, the conversation shortens. They smile, they nod, they maintain a composed surface, but behind their eyes there is a step backward, not rejection, panic, a panic they have been masking for years. People who avoid intimacy are not running from you. They are running from the emotional image of themselves that surfaces when someone actually reaches them. The tenderness you touch in them threatens the walls they built to survive their own history. Your presence becomes both shelter and threat at once. Their internal system does not read affection as safety. It reads it as exposure. So when you offer sincerity, warmth, and availability, something inside them stiffens. The instinct says, pull back, before the heart becomes vulnerable. You notice it in the simplest scenes. You ask how their day went and they answer quickly, as though emotions were fragile objects they don't know how to handle. You try to go deeper, and they change the subject. Not because they feel nothing, but because they feel more than they can manage. People who avoid intimacy want closeness, but from a distance. They want connection, but without revealing themselves. They want security, but they tremble when someone actually offers it. That contradiction becomes the center of the relationship. And the closer you get, the more something inside them starts to seize. You see it in their daily patterns. After a peaceful day, they become cold. After an intense moment, they grow distant. After a real emotional exchange, they close off like a room with no light. It is always the same cycle: desire, connection, fear, retreat. You find yourself confused because the contrast is sharp. One day they are warm, present, almost transparent. The next they are remote, unreachable, lost inside a private maze. You tend to take it personally, but that withdrawal is not about you. It speaks to what moves inside them. Deep in their history lives an old script. If you get too close, you can lose everything. If you trust someone, they will eventually leave. If you show your heart, you become vulnerable. These thoughts don't emerge as words. They emerge as behaviors. And often people who fear closeness are not even aware of what is really happening. They feel only a tightness, an inexplicable discomfort that pushes them to retreat, disappear for a while, take shelter in surface-level conversation. For years they have told themselves that feelings are dangerous, so every strong emotion is treated like a spark to smother. Your closeness lights that spark. Your affection, your honesty, your direct way of making contact, all of it dissolves their defenses. And for someone who has learned to survive by staying rigid, dissolving is terrifying. And here is the part that stings. The more genuine your love, the more they tremble. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you represent exactly what they want and fear in equal measure. You offer depth, and depth is exactly what frightens them. Understanding makes them feel seen in ways they are not ready for. Stability to someone wired for chaos feels less like safety and more like a trap. Their retreat is not an insult to your worth. It is a shield against their own vulnerability. So they step back, convinced that distance will return them a sense of control. But something else happens. The distance grows, yes, but so does the fracture. Because while avoidance protects them from feeling overwhelmed, it also keeps them from receiving the love they want more than they will admit. Here you see the hidden mechanism. Your openness triggers their fear, and their fear triggers your insecurity. You keep reaching for an explanation, they keep reaching for an exit, and the relationship becomes a silent dance you both know but neither of you names. When you recognize it, the whole story reassembles, because the problem was never your love, it was their fear. And the moment you see that clearly, the spell breaks. Underneath, the truth you needed to reclaim your strength finally appears. That is the moment your perspective shifts, and the next step becomes inevitable. If what we just covered, the avoidant pattern, the way distance gets mistaken for strength, feels like something you have been living rather than just watching, my ebook, The Power of Not Reacting, goes much deeper into exactly this. Channel subscribers get 37% off. The link is in the first pinned comment. The shift doesn't arrive with a dramatic scene. There is no speech, no confrontation, no theatrical gesture. It begins in the most ordinary places, when you finally grow tired of carrying questions that were never given an answer. It does not come from anger, it comes from clarity. A clarity that builds without rushing and never points in the wrong direction. It starts on an unremarkable afternoon, when you admit to yourself quietly and finally that you can no longer reserve emotional space for someone who disappears every time things become real. You look at your phone without expecting anything, and somewhere inside you a voice at last says enough. You don't write a message, don't rehearse a speech, don't stage a goodbye. It happens inside, like the heart quietly reorganizing its priorities. You realize you spent months turning silence into riddles, wondering if their pauses meant something, hoping the distance was temporary. And then the awareness hits you. You were building bridges for someone who never learned to meet you from the other side. That awareness does not break you, it straightens you. It tells you that loving is not the problem, doing it entirely alone is. You begin to see patterns you used to overlook. Every time you opened up, they found a reason to step back. Every time you were honest, they stiffened. And you spent more time managing their fears than listening to your own needs. These are not accusations, they are recognitions. The first internal step, giving a name to what you actually lived. And suddenly you stop idealizing their distance. You stop calling it mystery. You stop dressing it up as sensitivity. You see what was always there. You were offering depth to someone who was afraid of deep water. That is when the shift locks in. Not loud, not dramatic, just precise. Like a piece falling into the right place. You are reading or making dinner or doing nothing in particular, and the thought arrives without drama. You stop needing this to make sense, not because you found the answer, because you understood that some questions were only keeping you inside a room that had already emptied. And you make another decision. Silence will no longer be the punishment they give you. It will be the boundary you set for yourself. Your absence will no longer be a reaction. It will be a choice to protect your own emotional presence. In that decision, there is a strange, almost subtle peace. You feel it while folding laundry, answering an email, driving home as the city lights blur into color across the windshield. It is the moment your heart stops reaching outward and slowly begins to come home, back to you. And the longer you sit with that truth, the more you understand that staying attached to someone who runs from closeness is a slow, silent form of abandoning yourself. The choice now is not to chase, not to explain, not to beg for space inside someone else's emotional maze. You choose yourself, not out of pride, but to breathe. And when that choice takes root, something dissolves. The emotional hold they had on you lifts like fog in morning sun. You stop wondering what they think. You stop hoping for an impossible change. You stop letting them define who you are. This does not mean you stop feeling. It means you stop bleeding for someone who never truly knew how to hold you. Your inner world comes into focus. Your boundaries become solid. Your breathing slows, freer, more yours. And this invisible decision, the one nobody applauds, the one nobody even notices, becomes the quiet moment your story changes direction. Not away from love, but toward a healthier version of it, toward yourself. You finally understand that losing someone who fears intimacy is not a loss. Losing yourself trying to keep them would be. The choice is made. Now comes the time to live it. Change does not begin when you feel strong. It begins when you act differently in the small corners of your day, in the places where emotion used to decide for you. You notice it first in how you respond to your phone. A message that once made your pulse spike now earns only a slow breath. You don't rush to respond. You don't spiral. You wait, because clarity has no urgency. Your new behavior is born in these small pauses. The pause before you respond. The pause before you explain yourself. The pause before you give too much of yourself away. These pauses are power wearing the face of stillness. You no longer check if they watched your story. You don't refresh the chat. You open the window, make your coffee, and let the day begin without dragging anyone else's emotional absence into it. You are not becoming cold. You are becoming precise. Your energy is returning to where it belongs. You. Something shifts in your conversations too. When they send a vague message, you do not fill it in for them. You do not bridge the gap they leave. You answer simply, neutral, clean, without bending yourself into more comfortable shapes for someone who fears closeness. Okay, I understand. Thanks for letting me know. Brief, clean, clear. Words without emotional cost. Less performance, more truth. Over time, this becomes your new emotional baseline. You stop reacting. You stop rescuing the connection. You stop offering warmth to someone who retreats the moment they feel it. This shows up in how you protect your routines too. You no longer structure your day around the possibility they might appear. You live your plans without compressing them for someone who never compressed anything for you. You go to the gym because it is good for you. You cook without wondering if they will text. You take a walk because silence now is not punishment, it is refuge. In this phase, you stop convincing yourself that crumbs are commitment. When something from them appears, a name, a voice note, a reference that was clearly aimed at you, you notice that the old reflex has slowed down. What used to feel like an opening now reads more accurately. Someone testing whether the door is still unlocked. You look at it the way you look at weather, present, but not deciding anything for you. You do not chase, you do not push. You do not sacrifice your peace to make them more comfortable. You let their distance remain theirs. You let their silence speak for itself. This is not cruelty. This is alignment. And something powerful happens when you begin acting from this new internal place. Your nervous system finally starts to heal. The constant vigilance softens. The emotional tension dissolves. You stop waiting on emotional scraps and start feeding your own life again. Instead of what did I do wrong, comes what is this pattern showing me? Instead of why did they pull away comes why did I stay loyal to someone who was only loyal to their own fear? You replace self-blame with observation, and observation becomes liberation. Their unpredictability no longer sets the weather inside your chest. A message from them no longer interrupts your peace. Their distance no longer touches your worth. This is execution at its highest level, living without placing someone else's fear at the center of your existence. And the more you repeat these small daily choices, the more the weight lifts. Your steps become steady, your voice becomes calm, your mind becomes clear, because when you change how you act, life changes how it responds. The real test does not arrive with a warning. It arrives on an ordinary day hidden in something small, a notification, a memory, a moment of solitude. It is not drama, it is familiarity, and familiarity is dangerous. You feel it when their name appears on your screen after days of silence. Your chest tightens for a moment, not because you want them back, but because the body remembers its old reflex. This is the first temptation, confusing a habit with a desire. You breathe and wait, and remember who you are becoming. Their message no longer deserves your urgency. Then another test arrives. A quiet evening, the city feeling too large. A memory surfaces from somewhere unexpected, not a place, but a specific tone of voice, a way they used to say your name when things were still good. For a moment, nostalgia tries to rewrite the past. making only the bright parts visible. This is also a temptation. Memory pretending to be truth. You sit with the feeling without obeying it. You let it move through you without pulling you backward. That is how you learn that longing and healing can coexist, without asking you to return to what hurt you. The tests keep coming. A photo from months ago. A sudden thought, I could just message them. But underneath that impulse lives the old version of you, the one who believed your effort could heal their fear. You recognize the voice. You do not follow it. Another temptation takes the shape of their inconsistency. They disappear, then suddenly become warm. They retreat, then send something intimate. The old question rises. Maybe this time it will be different. But something in you is wiser now. You look at the pattern, not the moment. You remember the cycle, the chasing, the imbalance, and you choose not to walk back into that emotional maze. One of the harder tests arrives when you feel strong. That is exactly when part of you thinks you could handle their inconsistency again. I'm different now. Maybe I can tolerate the distance. But that thought is a trap. Strength is not returning to the storm. Strength is no longer needing the storm. The greatest temptation arrives when they sense your change. They feel your emotional distance and suddenly become more curious, more affectionate, more present. People who fear intimacy are not immune to loss. They react to losing access. But you are no longer the person who settled for crumbs. Their sudden interest does not look like hope to you. It looks like proof of a cycle you have already moved past. You move with a calm they can no longer shake. Every temptation is a mirror. It shows you who you were. It shows you who you are becoming. And every time you choose differently, you carve a new emotional path, one that does not bend to fear, one that does not shrink to accommodate someone else's avoidance. This is how healing tests you, not by removing the temptation, but by asking you to recognize it without surrendering to it. And when you pass enough of these tests, something subtle but powerful happens. The pull weakens, the reflex softens, memories lose their emotional edge. You begin to move through your days without their shadow over everything. You have already crossed the threshold. Now you are learning to stay there. Stability does not arrive like a triumph. It settles slowly, almost invisibly, into the fabric of your habits. Healing makes no noise. It lands piece by piece in the spaces where anxiety used to live. You feel it on a quiet morning when you realize your thoughts are no longer circling their absence. You drink your coffee without scanning your emotions for pain. The silence that used to sting is now neutral. You breathe differently. Consolidation begins when your emotional system stops reacting to old triggers. A tone of voice no longer pulls you backward. Their name does not sting anymore. A memory does not reopen a wound. It simply tells a story. That is the internal passage. Your heart stops confusing the past with the present. You begin making choices that reflect your new clarity. You speak honestly with yourself. You stop compressing your needs to fit someone else's fears. You trust your instincts again. There comes a moment when you realize you no longer want the version of the relationship you once would have fought for. That version loaded everything onto your shoulders. Now you see how imbalanced it really was. That awareness does not bring sadness. It brings relief. Consolidation shows up in your boundaries too. You say no more easily. You express what you feel without apologizing for it. You no longer chase clarity from the outside. It comes from within. Your emotional landscape becomes quieter, more grounded. Storms that once destroyed entire days now pass without devastating you. You are not avoiding emotions. You are regulating them. One of the clearest signs of consolidation is this. You stop checking whether they have changed. You stop imagining a return. You stop tying your value to their behavior. Your story no longer depends on their choices. The peace you feel is not perfection. It is ownership. It is emotional mastery. It is the quiet strength of someone who finally holds their own life with both hands. And as this stability takes root, the old version of you, the one who accepted half of someone's emotional presence, begins to fade. You no longer bend around someone else's avoidance. You stand on ground that belongs entirely to you. This is the moment just before the final transformation, the moment your inner world stops trembling, the moment you become immovable. And from this quiet center, the consequences begin to surface. Not as revenge, not as punishment, but as truth finally revealing itself. The consequences arrive without drama. Life does not warn you when power shifts. It lets you discover it in the calm difference between who you were and who you have become. The first consequence appears when you move through your day without thinking of them. No effort required, no discipline. You simply forget. You forget to check your phone. You forget to reconstruct conversations. You forget the weight that used to sit in your chest. This forgetting is not loss, it is freedom. Meanwhile, they begin to sense the change. Your silence no longer reads as a reaction. It reads as distance, the real kind, the kind that does not ask, the kind that does not collapse, the kind that does not wait on the doorstep. You notice the shift when they resurface in small, uncertain ways, a message thrown out casually, a fragile attempt to recapture your attention. But your energy lives elsewhere now. You observe the message the way you observe a cloud passing, something that moves through, not something that takes you with it. Another consequence appears when you finally see them clearly, for the first time. Not the character you constructed in your mind, not the version you hoped they might become, but what they always were, someone who feared intimacy more than they desired connection, someone whose absence taught you far more than their presence ever did. In that truth there is no revenge, only reality. Then comes the consequence they did not anticipate. You stop needing a conclusion, not because you found all the answers, but because the questions have lost their meaning. You no longer wait for a redemptive turn. You no longer imagine a version of them that finally chooses you. Your story moves forward without their permission. In the days that follow, they begin to feel what you once felt, the uncertainty, the curiosity, that quiet echo that bites at the edges of awareness. Your emotional distance forces them to face what they spent years avoiding, fear, longing, regret. And for the first time they are genuinely confronted with what it means to lose someone whose love was safe. But you no longer orbit in their emotional gravity. Your life expands into new habits, new thoughts, new versions of yourself that could never have been born while you were shrinking so they wouldn't feel threatened. The final consequence arrives as an unexpected realization. You no longer want them back, not because they were never important, but because you have moved past the place where they left you. Your boundaries are now natural. Your peace is earned. And while they may attempt to return, looking for the warmth you once gave without hesitation, you meet them with a calm that closes the story without needing a single word. You don't fight it, don't explain it. Don't pull open doors that your growth has already sealed shut. It is your evolution that speaks. This is the final turn of the page, the quiet moment when power returns to your hands permanently. Not because you won, but because you healed. And healing always ends the game. Some endings come with noise, arguments, slammed doors, a final scene. And then there are endings like this one, silent, precise, inevitable. Endings where you do not need to raise your voice because your evolution speaks for you. You arrive here without revenge, without bitterness, without the need to prove anything. You arrive because you have seen yourself with new eyes, because you understood that love cannot survive where one person builds bridges and the other builds walls. Because you discovered that your silence, the one you once mistook for weakness, has become your most powerful declaration of freedom. When you go silent, you are not disappearing. You are returning to yourself. You are gathering your energy. You are breaking a cycle that took more than it ever gave. And the truth is, when the heart stops breaking itself for someone, it finally begins beating for itself again. Looking back, you realize you did not lose anything. You released what was keeping you still. You let go of versions of yourself that no longer belonged to you. You made room for a life built not on someone else's uncertainty, but on the solidity of your own worth. And as you walk forward, not in body but in consciousness, something becomes impossible to unsee. The peace you searched for outside yourself. You find it within. The calm you hoped they would give you. It arrives the moment you stop running after them. And the strength you believed you didn't have, it grows the instant you stop making yourself small for anyone. This is where the story closes. Not because someone decided to return or to change, but because you decided not to go back to where you weren't growing. Your silence is not a pause. It is a door that closes from the inside, a door that protects what you have finally learned to honor, yourself. If this kind of reflection speaks to something in you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Every gesture helps bring more clarity to people walking through their own version of this story. And if you want to take this further, the practical framework behind everything we just covered, my ebook, The Power of Not Reacting, is in the first pinned comment. Channel subscribers get 37% off. Because the real shift was never about what you stopped saying. It was about what you stopped asking for, from someone who was never going to give it. And when you no longer need the answer, the question loses its hold. That is not silence. That is just your life finally moving at your own speed, own